Welcome, and thanks for listening to Truth, Wisdom, Freedom Conversations. Each week, I'm joined by various conscious leaders as we discover more pathways in becoming heart-centered human beings. This is your host, author, and spiritual coach, Chong. And don't forget to subscribe and review us on iTunes or Google Play. Hi everyone, welcome to Truth, Wisdom, Freedom Conversations. I am really excited to have here Toby Johnson, all the way in Texas. How are you, Toby?
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks so much for joining me. And to tell you a little bit about Toby and what we're talking about today, we're talking about spirituality and homosexuality, sex, sensuality, and what that means, and adopting a more non-dualistic way of viewing the world and how that can improve the quality of our lives, and also what it means to be a gay person and also to be spiritual at the same time, because there is often a division between the two because of the dogma of the Abrahamic traditions and how religion has placed an emphasis on what is right, what is wrong. So we're here to really discuss and debunk certain myths and to offer new ways of looking at spirituality and sexuality and sensuality. And so Toby here, he has a very interesting life coming from a Catholic background, and he was a monk in 2 different orders. He's going to tell you all about that. He's also the author of 10 books that span from fiction to nonfiction, and he has a master's in comparative religion and a PhD in counseling psychology, which makes for a fascinating background to talk about all of these topics that we're here to talk about today. So maybe, Toby, you want to tell the listeners something about what you learned from your religious background and how that transitioned you into the sensual sexuality, spirituality work that you do today.
Yes, let me say a little bit about, my own autobiography. One of the big ideas that I espouse is that we are deeply influenced, obviously, by what happens to us in our lives. The purpose of religion is to provide interesting ideas to help us understand what's happening to us. I grew up in Texas, in the United States, in the 1950s and 60s. Out of high school, I joined the religious order of teaching brothers, the Marianists, who taught at my school, and was with them for a couple of years. I got told to leave the order. Looking back, it was because I was gay. They didn't explain it at the time.
Did you know you were gay then when you joined the order?
No, I hadn't. This is in 1960. I had no idea what any of this was. I didn't know what gay meant, and I really didn't understand what sex was.
What was your main reason for joining the order at that time?
Well, because I was deeply religious. Also, looking back on it, I see that this was a way to avoid the issue of girls and dating and marriage and family and all those expectations. I think that's why people join religious life, is to avoid having to deal with heterosexuality. I don't think all religious are homosexual, but I do think they all wanted to avoid heterosexuality for one reason or another. And then built into that an idea that it's more noble and better to not marry. A lot of what comes off in religion as this idea of chastity as holy is really they're saying to be religious, it's nice to be free of the responsibility of marriage and child rearing. And if you are a social worker or a doctor and want to do work for the poor or be a saint, well, if you aren't married and don't have your own children, you're more able to be concerned about everybody's children. So there is something wonderful about not being married and being normal, giving you freedom. And this turns out to be especially true for gay people, because that ends up happening to us, whether we're going into religious life or just going into life, free of heterosexuality. I don't mean to belittle heterosexuality. It's wonderful that they do such things, because we wouldn't be here
if
it weren't for the heterosexuals. But we do have a different set of experiences from them because of how we live and how we experience love.
So what were some of the main perspective differences you had growing up, especially being gay in the 50s and 60s, which is a very different experience to young gay people now, and especially in my generation in the 90s and early 2000s, right?
I think compared to youth today, y'all know what sex is. It's available on the computer and it's just out there and it's talked about on television. When I was growing up in the 50s, TV sitcoms, the characters could not sleep in the same bed. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz in I Love Lucy slept in twin beds.
I remember that.
Just ridiculous, you know? All of that was hidden. I was in this religious order out of high school, went to a Catholic college, St. Louis University. I met another religious order that was very forward and progressive called the Servites. I fell in love with one of the Servite guys. Nothing ever happened between us, much to my chagrin. They were a wonderful group of men trying to modernize at the time when the Catholic Church was modernizing in the late 60s, and were involved in the peace movement. One of my friends in the order had been in those groups that poured blood on draft files to oppose the war. There were a number of actions like that of Catholic religious against the Vietnam War, which was the big issue in my childhood. Well, anyway, I was with that order and ended up in California. The order had a house in Riverside, California, which is outside Los Angeles, a very neat place. It was a grand experience to me, and my one great mystical experience happened in the chapel of that building. So whenever I talk about spirituality, that building comes up. Well, in brief, I will say that I was having a hard day. I was working in the kitchen that day. There was a lot of stress, some having to do with this guy that I was in love with. But the big thing was sort of emotional pressure. The novice master asked me to put away the buffing machine. He had cleaned the floor. There's a whole story about why that needed cleaning. The buffing machine was kept at the back of the chapel. And I was taking this buffing machine, and several times the thing popped apart and I caught my fingers in the brush trying to fix it. And it was just, everything was going bad that day. And a whole bunch of folding chairs fell over on me. Anyway, I got the buffing machine put away. And during this, I was thinking, oh, how, just how awful this is. And why is this happening to me? And then sort of came this thought, oh, well, one of the things I believe is that through our lives, God shapes us and perhaps teaches us lessons, creates things for us. So I was thinking, well, I should understand that this is God acting in my life, like a potter shaping the clay. And then the next step was, no, it isn't that the world is the pot that God is shaping. This is the face of God. The experience that I was having at that moment is God. In whatever way this means anything, the walls of the chapel opened up and it was like I was just somewhere beyond. It was an incredible sense of just being part of everything. And that what God is this experience of the fullness of reality, which is inside every one of us all the time. But we don't get to see it except under stress.
It's interesting because I had a similar experience. I wasn't in a chapel. I was on campus in a college dormitory. And I think that people who have not had this kind of experience of connection to oneness, to the environment, to the external and the internal worlds. I mean, everyone describes it in different ways, but the way that you're describing it, I can relate back to my first mystical experience where it felt, for me, I compare it to a Lion King moment where, when Simba's being born and he's being held up in front of the entire, the whole kingdom of animals and the sky parts and the sunlight comes through. That's kind of how it felt like for me, and time stopped almost in a way. And it was this experience that I hadn't really felt until I had plant medicine experiences where there were hallucinogenics involved, right? But that was without, and this was, it caught me by surprise because I did not have a religious upbringing growing up the way that you had. So for me, it was like, what is this? So it was quite jarring, but it did catalyze a massive change in direction in my life at the time. And so for you had this mystical experience and you had this realization about God existing everywhere around you, through you, as you. So where did that take you? How did that affect you? Had you come out then as a gay man?
Let's see now. This is, oh, you've raised an interesting question. Yeah, I guess I had had a couple of experiences, not real full sex, but sex play and even to ejaculation with one of the other brothers. We sort of sneaked around the halls at night a few times.
You're experiencing an exploration in sexuality, sensuality, right? And then you're also having mystical, spiritual experiences. So I'm curious as to what was going on in your mind in relationship to everything you had learned about Catholic religious life and being a monk and taking chastity vows. Were you in conflict because there was this desire for you to explore having relationships with other men?
Well, I don't think it was conflict, and I'm very fortunate in that respect. Let me add one more piece to this, that the year before this happened, I had read Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Joseph Campbell becomes very important in my life. Joseph Campbell was a professor of religion and mythology at Sarah Lawrence College. He was a brilliant man, had written a lot of books, but didn't really become famous until the end of his life. When he was in his 60s, he started giving public lectures. I happened to attend one of those public lectures as a work scholar, assisting in setting up the place, and met him personally at the beginning of the seminar. He ended up becoming a friend and corresponding with him for about 10 years off and on, and being on the crew that worked his appearances in San Francisco. Campbell's big idea is that all these mythological stories that have come down to us, like the Holy Grail and King Arthur and the Greek gods and Egyptian gods and the Christian gods, all of these stories are designed to shape how our minds work. They're not true. The truth of them is how they make us behave. If believing certain things makes you loving and helpful and good, then it's true for you. And it has nothing to do with whether this really happened historically, because most of these things
Are symbolic.
They're so long ago in the past, they're symbolic, they're metaphors. So I had already learned that. And I think in a way, my mystical experience is this realization that, oh, this is what all that was. This is what all that was about. In some way, I understood my sexual feelings, my love for Alan, this seminarian that I had the crush on. I experienced those things as spiritual. It was not that, oh, I want to do something terrible with him. It was that I love him and want him to love me for the love of God. It's because we're both wanting to be good guys and good people. We were religious, so it's got all this Christian religion involved in it.
Do you feel that's a rare perspective to adopt? And I don't have personal experience in that, but from stories read and seen on documentaries and movies, there's always this religious conflict around sexuality and breaking chastity vows. And you had the fortune of feeling that it was actually an expression of God's love. Do you feel that was a rare experience to have that at that time?
Well, I hope it isn't. One of my observations is that gay men, as I knew what gay men was in the 60s and 70s when I was in San Francisco, I think gay men tend to be naturally religious. We end up angry at religion because we discover we know better. And so now the expression is spiritual, not religious, meaning you've got this sense that there's something bigger, that life means something, there's a reason why you're here. I think we tend to do that partly because we don't have children. Our future is not going to be our offspring growing up and replacing us the way the heterosexual model suggests. If we're going to have an effect in the world, our legacy is going to be by how we make things better. Those natural human things about being concerned about children in the future and responsibilities to society, all that comes out for us, is meaningful for us, but outside the model of religion that the traditional church teaches.
Right. What
You know?
about people who, let's say, homosexuals who feel the urge to, let's say, procreate or to have a nuclear family and to follow the heteronormative path? Do you feel that that is true for those people?
Well, that's an interesting phenomenon. That's something new. In my day, we didn't do that. Now, there were a lot of homosexuals who had children because they had been in heterosexual marriages. Let me say that I am a great believer in self-determination, and I think people make their choices. And if the God within is telling you that this is what you should do, then I think, of course, do it. There's no right way to be gay. There's no right way to be a human being. We're making it up. It makes more sense to me, actually, that gay couples who wanted children would adopt children that somebody else didn't want, because then we are providing a service. The world is so overcrowded. We're trying to reduce the number of people and not get the homosexuals to start having children too. There are enough heterosexuals having children. But it's what your life leads you to, because our lives are leading us somewhere. Campbell's idea that all the religions are symbolic, for me, was a tremendous message of liberation. I didn't have to be so concerned about what the Catholic Church said about sex, because I was experiencing it differently. And I have to make up my own religion and my own faith and find my own God, not accept the God that the church is necessarily preaching down on the corner in their building. This idea of understanding religion from over and above is very important. It's our way out of the conflict.
So maybe we can cite some examples to share with the audience of how historically in religion, before we jumped on this podcast, we were talking a little bit about the mythology of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians, and even in ancient Hinduism that, Vishnu masturbated the universe into existence, right? So a lot of these creation stories, they integrate sexuality and spirituality together, and sex itself, that it's not something to be demonized and hidden away and to be shamed, right? And it seems as if that a lot of the Abrahamic traditions have made it something it's a sin, right? So, and in making it a sin, there's judgment involved, there's guilt, there's shame, there's expectations, there's stigma placed on the act of procreation, on the act of joy and enjoying being with someone and feeling a certain way, feeling good, masturbating, all of this. So can you talk a little bit about
one of
pleasure and spirituality and what that means to you in everything that you've experienced in your life and in the comparative religion studies that you've done?
Sort of this, what I'm calling comparative religion, allows us to understand, for instance, that the Abrahamic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, come out of a desert people. Water was scarce. There were rules about how to live in a harsh environment like that. If you broke the rules, you endangered your own life and you endangered the life of the community. They had rigid rules and they had a rigid God. Most of the rules are all taboos, about what you can do and what you can't do. Jesus comes along and gives the message that you're not saved by being free of taboo violations. You were saved by being a good person and being loving. Religion shouldn't be about avoiding sins, but about being good and virtuous. But so that's coming out of a desert culture. It ends up in Central Europe, in France, which is a lush, fertile country. You don't need those kind of rules. So Christianity goes through a great shift when it comes into France and into Europe. And religion, if you look in India is fertile. So you have gods who have sex. Again, we were talking about this earlier. The stories about Krishna are about this character who is sexual and the women all love him. Well, one of the great stories of Krishna, is that he was a cowherder. He appears to the girls who milk the cows. In order to satisfy them all one night, he multiplies himself so that there's one of him for everyone, and he takes them all out into the woods and has sex with all of them all simultaneously. We don't hear about Jesus doing things like that, but maybe there's an esoteric Christianity where that story is possible.
The world would be a very different place if the big three religions were not of the Abrahamic traditions, almost, right? It would almost, around the world, we would culturally have a different perspective on spirituality. It's interesting that the most rigid of the traditions have kind of imposed their way into modern culture in the way that we view certain social policies and how to treat people and human rights, right? I just find that really fascinating.
So much judgment.
And it could be that a lot of these other religions that, for the lack of a better word, more of the, I don't want to say feminine, but when I say feminine, it's the principle of receptivity and allowance versus female. And the masculine, I'm not talking about male, I'm talking about the principle of the masculine force, which is around structure and around rigidity. It's non-flexible, right? And so when I look at Western culture, it's very much influenced by rigid energy in the religious history of how that's influenced governmental, all of that, right? And then if we look at the East, which has been Hinduism and Buddhism, and then we look at the indigenous peoples around the world with shamanistic cultures, it's different. It's a little bit more, okay, let's connect with nature, the more animistic traditions, right?
And they have goddesses, and the male gods have consorts whom they're having sex with as they're creating. It's a very different model from this patriarchal ruler.
Eve wasn't shunned out of, like she was claimed in these traditions. There was this equality between the masculine and the feminine in these more Eastern indigenous traditions, right? And then there was this principle of non-duality versus the dualistic way of thinking that we see very much in heteronormative cultures.
I think that much of the polarization, duality between good and evil, right and wrong, communism and democracy, all these conflicting, competing forces, that kind of idea that the world is adversarial like that comes out of our basic heterosexuality. Most people are heterosexual. Most people experience that their sexual attraction and their purpose for being alive is tied up in somebody whose consciousness works different from theirs, whom they can't quite understand, whom they love but also are angered by. Men don't understand women. Women don't understand what men want. It's a joke. It's the basis of all our humor that men and women really can't get along. Gay people, queer people who live in a world where most of us are like each other, don't experience that kind of attraction across the opposition. We see our partners as reflections of our best selves. Just in our experience of love and our experience of the people around us, we live in a less polarized world. Most of my friends are men. Gay men, which isn't to say that I don't have women friends, and of course I do, and I have heterosexual friends, and they're all part of my world, but they're not quite as important because I'm gay, and so my world looks like a gay world. In that gay world, I think we learn to not be so judgmental. Now, there's a whole thing about gay oppression and how gay people end up suffering because of what straight people have done to us. Those things are in us. We can't help it because we live in this oppressed world. But I think in general, we're kinder, sweeter people, and we don't get as angry as much. I'm generalizing terribly, but it's what my life has shown me. And I think this is one of the great lessons of the spiritual religious traditions.
It's interesting what you bring up about opposition and like versus like. As you're speaking, it reminds me of, I was interviewing a homeopath in a previous week. And if we think about medicine, allopathic medicine is very much using opposites to heal.
Yes.
And homeopathic medicine, right, is using like and like to heal. And homeopathic medicine is not the majority of what is practiced around the world. It's the minority, right? Anything that is homo, of the same like, it seems that there's a pattern in history that it's always been a little bit of the minority. It makes sense because not moving on this thread of opposition, it forces us to step back and not engage in the thrills of drama, which is very much
Yes.
what the world has been used to for the last 4,000 years, right? There's empires and they rise and they fall, and there's kings and queens, and there's drama and intrigue. And that's kind of how life has been unfolding on this planet.
Yes, competition. It's all based in competition.
Right.
And all competition goes back to the very beginning with the male animals fighting each other for access to the female animals. Competition is based on the urge to procreate. Our whole idea of sex is all tied into conquering. Men conquer women. We use these warfare models to describe human relationships. It's just terrible because that's not actually what we're feeling.
This is the path more of that we're talking about with non-dualism, to not allow the opposition of how things appear to be to inform how we're living our lives, right?
One of my favorite myths, the story of this character, the bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. Very briefly, let me just tell the story. This is a made-up story created by the scholars of Mahayana Buddhism to convey a message. It's the Jesus story in a way, but without the blood. The story is that this young monk, this is in Buddhism, so he's been reincarnating for many years and many lifetimes. He's a young monk. He's always shown sitting bare-chested out by a stream, sitting on a wall usually, wearing women's jewelry and a women's scarf, so that he's sort of both male and female, because that's part of the story. Anyway, he's about to achieve his nirvana and go off and escape the round of reincarnation forever. And he hears this groan come up from nature. He comes out of his trance and says, "Oh, what is this?" And nature says, "Oh, Avalokiteshvara, life is hard. We are all in this veil of suffering. Your being around us has given us a reason to live because you're such a pretty, sweet, nice guy. We all love you so much. We hate to see you go. We're happy for you, but it is for ourselves that we grow." So he says, "Well, then I won't go. I can't leave all the rest of you here to suffer. In fact, it would be better if one suffered instead of all. I therefore vow to not enter nirvana myself until everybody enters nirvana. Indeed, I will go beyond that. I will take on the future incarnations of every sentient being into the future so that everybody can go to nirvana now." So at that moment, all sentient beings were enlightened and released, and Avalokiteshvara remains behind as the one being living in everybody. So this is a lesson taught to say, well, you should be compassionate to other people, because the soul that is in those other people over there is the same soul that is in you. And that's true whether you tell this with a myth or not. We are all human beings and we're living this life, and we've got to care for other people because we're looking at one perspective, they're looking at another. We're all that God within. And that mouthful of a name means the Lord who is seen within. Avalokiteshvara.
Avalokiteshvara, for those who are listening, is seen as the god that embodies compassion, and then is in the Eastern Chinese traditions becomes Guanyin, and Guanyin becomes the feminine embodiment, the goddess of compassion with thousands of arms who takes care of the world and wipes away their tears and cradles them and nurtures them.
My fellow Joseph Campbell loved this story, and that's how I got the enthusiasm from him. He refers to this way of looking at the world as the way of joyful participation in the sorrows of the world. That's what we live in. The world is sorrowful. We've got to participate, but we should participate joyfully, gaily. Campbell says there are three wonders of the bodhisattva. The first wonder is that she is androgynous, both fully male and fully female. The second wonder is that he, she, the bodhisattva, sees that there is no difference between the world of time and the world of eternity, no difference between life and nirvana. And the third wonder is that the first two wonders are the same. In order to, now this is my idea of, that as gay, we sort of transcend this duality polarization. One of the ways to enlightenment, you've got to get over thinking of good and bad, right and wrong, evil and us against them. We're all in this together.
This is the main work that we as gay people have to do. It's the emotional trauma that gets stuck and imprinted in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts, that we have to break free of, because we live, as you said, in an oppressed world that is mainly governed by a heteronormative patriarchal system that has said, this is what you must believe in. So, of course, we are conditioned with certain programs in our heads of ways of behavior and how to act and how to treat people. And I think that is what causes a lot of the inner oppression within the gay communities.
Yeah.
Because we haven't done the work to release the trauma, to come into the non-dualistic blueprint that we were designed to be in. If you look at gay people who are not following the spiritual path, actually the relationships there, they mirror very much the same kind of polarization that you see in heterosexual relationships. And heterosexual couples who are experiencing a spiritual path and they're doing a lot of inner work, they're moving more towards what you said about seeing the partner as a reflection of self. It's more homogenous versus, opposites attract, right? Which is the conditioned program that we are taught to believe.
Opposites cancel each other out.
Right.
Opposites fight, opposites clash. Of course, they find that as a beautiful frisson, that these things love and hate at the same time. Love and death, those are big themes in human consciousness. There is a way in which the human race really is, in our time, going through a kind of consciousness growth spurt. It's within the last 100 years that there's been all this intermixing of cultures around the world. We all grow up learning about other religions. We are exposed to other cultures. So this forces us to look at things from a higher perspective. And now the computer and the access to all knowledge, something is changing in what it means to be human. It frees us from the literal interpretation of religion and allows us to understand religion more as these wonderful stories and mythologies and symbols and poems to use to figure out meaning in our life and give beauty to our lives.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Before we get back to the show, I wanted to let you know that I will be running a queer-based spirituality program starting at the end of January, February of 2021. So if you are longing to deepen into your inner wisdom, to cultivate more self-acceptance, self-love, if you feel at all haunted by old wounds around shame or guilt or fear around your identity as a queer person, your self-worth, this is really going to be a deep dive of 8 weeks to really explore the energies behind certain thought patterns and belief systems that we have. And a lot of it really are not ours. It's just the inherited karma of being queer in this day and age. The whole point of this gathering and this program is to anchor you more deeply into self-acceptance, self-love, to have a more intimate connection with yourself and also then with other people. We are going to be experiencing lots of deep transformation from various modalities like shamanic journeying to creative visualizations, to guided meditation audios for homework, creative writing for expression and sharing, group conversations, as well as very deep energetic processes that are going to help us to unravel a lot of the things that we don't really understand why they are the way they are. But once the energy shifts, then consciousness will shift and everything around it will start to shift. So once again, this is for people of the LGBTQ plus community. And if you feel called to this, or you know of someone that might be interested in exploring their spirituality and working through some deep, deep stuff, feel free to reach out to me on my website at johnsonchong.com, johnsonchong.com, and feel free to share this. All right, now it's time to get back to the show. I want to go back and touch on shame, sex, and spirit, because if we're still talking about non-duality and how sex and spirit are the same, can you talk a little bit about sex as a sacred sacrament and pleasure and what that means on a spiritual path?
Yes, let me say that I have a formula for how to create this in your life. As you are coming to orgasm, either with your partner or a stranger or just by yourself, this is a part of our lives. As you are coming to orgasm, think, here comes God. And as you are coming and enjoying that great pleasure of being in the body and being somehow also in the spiritual consciousness or something, there's this thing we go into, this altered state. And in that altered state, put out the wish, may all beings be happy. That's the mantra of Avalokiteshvara. May all beings be happy. May all beings be well. If we put those kind of thoughts into our experience of orgasm, all of a sudden our experience of orgasm changes from this thing that maybe we're supposed to feel dirty about to feeling like, oh my God, this is a divine act. This is a sacrament. Keeping with my myth, the being who's enjoying this orgasm is Avalokiteshvara. He gets all the orgasms. And all those people we're having orgasms with are all incarnations of him too. You know, when we look at the porn videos and you look, you know, people are supposed to feel guilty about looking at porn. It's beautiful. And if you see that those men or women in the videos are also incarnations of Avalokiteshvara, then you see, oh, look, here are all these people happily sharing their joyful participation in the sorrows of the world to help the rest of us enjoy and be joyful about our incarnations. Everything can be shifted to joy instead of shame and guilt.
That's a very different way of viewing joy and sexuality and spirituality. And I agree with you, actually. But what do you say to people who, let's say, are doing all of these courses on porn addiction? How does addiction play into the experience of intimacy? Because I've had this experience of, you know, using orgasm to move beyond the self, right? So that's what you're saying, right? But of course, that's a very advanced concept. Not everyone is going to do that, because if they haven't worked on their emotional trauma, they're going to see sex as an act of self-gratification and feeling like they're valuable and worthy, which is a lower vibration of what sex can do, because it has this greater potential of changing our brain states, moving us into an altered state of consciousness, like you said, right? And if we have not released the emotional trauma and we're in that state of neediness and codependency, we're using sex on a lower vibration. So then porn becomes this addictive thing to feel something gratifying about yourself, and it's validating that you're worthy, right? And so it has this lower vibration of neediness, right? So do you feel that what you're saying, it sounds very advanced, it almost feels like people need to go through a stage of releasing and shedding certain perspectives before they can even get there? So what do you feel like are there steps before someone can get there? Maybe sharing from your own personal life, because I don't feel that's accessible for everyone right now.
Well, yes and no. I think you have to hear this idea in order to get it. I've written some books and written about gay spirituality and written this stuff. That's a way of sharing it. A part of my joke about my life is that I'm Joseph Campbell's apostle to the gay community. We all need to hear this new way of understanding religion. I do have to say, built into the social services and being a therapist, I was a therapist and I worked in mental health for years. There's a way in which we had to make people's behavior something that needed curing so that we had something to do. And I don't mean to say that there aren't people who are addicted to sex or that for whom porn has turned out to be a bad experience. There certainly are drugs that are bad drugs. Crystal meth turned out to be a bad drug for you, whereas marijuana and maybe ayahuasca are drugs that open the soul rather than close the soul. Those are things we have to experiment with and learn about from other people's experience. There was an emphasis on sex addiction back in the early days of AIDS, which was a little bit of buying into the guilt about AIDS. It's true that we needed to learn to control our sex when AIDS came around, like we need to control our going outside and wearing masks under COVID now that it's around. We learned how to cope, and all that sex addiction stuff was important at that time. But there's also a way in which all of that is just looking negatively at what it would be better to just flip over and look at positively. And why go through all that? But it's how you learn about it. We all are going to go through our particular path. God is shaping us like the vase, and that God is the God that's inside us.
Beautiful. I like that. Yeah, we're for sure all learning differently and experiencing life differently. And some of us need to learn more through suffering. Some of us will hear an idea and shift instantly. And so everyone will just take this information and do what they will that's most aligned to their growth.
One of the ideas that I've had all my life, I think this is heresy, but I think it's right. When you look at these stories like Avalokiteshvara and Buddhism and Zen and the realization that this is it, those are things that you have to learn through working to get them. But if they're true, well, then they're true. You don't have to do anything. It's right here. It's already given. This current experience is the experience of God. And if you just keep telling yourself that, it gets to look more and more like what the experience of God ought to look like. I do agree with working your way through things, but there's also a way, like, you know, the story of Alexander the Great and the Gordian knot? There was a myth that there was this big knot that had been built, and it was said that someone who could untie that knot could conquer all of Asia. And Alexander the Great walks up to it and takes a sword and cuts it in half. There wasn't any untying needed at all. You just cut it. Recently, I heard a computer joke about finding a needle in a haystack. First, burn the haystack. First, burn the haystack.
Well, that's kind of how I see when I say emotional trauma and shifting the perspectives around that. That's very much how I see it. We need to burn it away. Because I come from a lineage of shamanism that is very much the path of fire. And if we walk through the fire, things happen very quickly. It's like the path of Tantra. It's a very quick way of liberation, of freedom, inner freedom. I feel, my personal experience anyway, is that when we burn away enough of the crap that we carry in our mental conditioning, our emotional behaviors, that the joy will naturally unravel out of that. Kind of like what you said. I love what you just said about the needle and haystack. Burn the haystack first, and then you will find the needle. And so a lot of the work that I ended up doing for me personally has been burning the freaking haystack. I mean, it was rather slow, but then when the fire started going, it's like, woo, oh, what's there? Oh, wow, look, pearls and crystals. And that feels really nice. I don't have that guilt and judgment and shame. It's fallen away because I don't have the hay surrounding the purity of what is.
And life gives us lots of fire. Life is just constant. The trick is not to resist. Go with the flow. Accept that this is the way it is, because this is what heaven looks like from this particular perspective.
For sure. Yes. Do you want to talk a little bit about your book, Finding God in the Sexual Underworld?
Well, sort of what maybe started us talking about this. I recently redid my second book from 1983, which then was called In Search of God in the Sexual Underworld. That was a title that the publishing company came up with. There were a whole spate of things called In Search of This and In Search of That. I think Arthur C. Clarke even had a TV show called In Search of. Arthur C. Clarke, you know, the science fiction writer, one of the great influences on me too. He was a gay man. When you understand that and look at his science fiction novels, there's this gay wisdom that comes through there. I've rewritten the book as sort of updating it some, telling a little bit more about my own personal experiences. I worked in a study of teenage prostitution. The federal government in those days ran halfway houses for runaway youth. This had all started in the late 60s during the Summer of Love and the hippie movement in America. kids running away from home to go to San Francisco for the Summer of Love was a big deal. Big cities all over the country had halfway houses. The halfway houses had a rule that if the kids were sexually active, they couldn't be part of the program. And of course, in cities like San Francisco and New York, where you had large gay communities, a lot of those runaway youth were young gay kids who had been thrown out of their homes for being gay, or knew they were gay and couldn't stay at home and came to San Francisco because that's where they knew they'd find gay people. And they aren't old enough to get into the bars, so they end up living on the street or in hustler hotels or something and hustling. A friend, Toby Murata, and I, my writing partner in those days, we have this same boyish nickname, Toby. We got hired by a consulting firm in San Francisco to study these issues in order to make recommendations for how the halfway houses could handle kids who were sexually active and hustling. It was a little bit of a nightmare for me. I mean, it was a wonderful experience. It scared me out of San Francisco and everything else. But so I have the story of this working in that study. From my perspective as a scholar of comparative religion and a seeker on a spiritual path, this book has got a lot of my pro-sex ideas, pro-gay ideas. As in a way, the conclusion of the study was that the problems in this sexual underworld, the problems for those kids that were hustling, were more caused by the judgment made about them than by the problems themselves. It's because of this guilt and shame that you were talking about, Johnson, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I mean, if we think about ancient cultures and the archetype of the prostitute or the consort, right, there wasn't the kind of guilt and shame that we currently have in our modern day culture. You think about ancient Chinese culture, I mean, everyone was sleeping around with everybody, and it was almost an honor to the family to offer up someone as the consort to raise the family up to a higher status.
And
There wasn't a kind of shame there. It was seen as family duty. It had a different relationship with the act of offering yourself up for sex, right? And the underworld for sex now is very different because of our cultural and social conditioned patterns, right? Kind of like what you said earlier, we're all going to make choices and decisions that are most aligned for us on our path. And for some people, you know, maybe the hustling is their way to find a deeper aspect of themselves through a whole process of self-discovery through that journey of the sexual underworld. And for some, it's going to cause a great deal of pain, and they need to recover from addiction and abuse and whatnot. It's going to be very different for different people. But I think that that perspective of looking at the sexual underworld as a path of spiritual awakening is not a voice or perspective that we hear enough of. We hear so much of the other stuff, which is the pain and the trauma and the addiction. Oh my goodness, right? A few weeks ago, I interviewed someone who was a sex worker. She was a sex worker when she was 12 for 7 years. And it actually brought her on a spiritual path, became a Juris Doctor of Law and also a business architect. And now she has her own company. And that was a whole journey that she went through from that. And she was talking about it being a journey of self-worth and self-value that she needed to, it was a journey of her claiming her power. That was what it was for her, right? And of course there was the judgment of others on her and whatever that was in her personal experience of that. But in retrospect and in the overall picture, it was a journey of empowerment. And so we often just drop right to conclusions about people when we see them in the sexual underworld. Oh my goodness, I can't believe they do it. It's something for us to look at as people. Why are we judging them like that? Who put those thoughts in our heads? Is that something I genuinely feel about this person, or is that, do I need to reevaluate what my opinions are and what my judgments are about other people and their paths?
Yes. Release judgments. You know, in Greek mythology, this idea of the underworld was not an evil hell. It was the collective unconscious, the things that we are part of because we're human. The underworld is not an evil place. It is a natural place. So when I write about the sexual underworld, it isn't, I mean, I kind of do a pun on the meaning that the underworld really is the thing that connects us all. We are all so human. And part of that experience of being sexual and, even the impersonal sex, in my day in the 70s, this was easier because the diseases hadn't showed up yet. And we were having a heyday that decade of the 70s. You went to the bathhouse and it was like dropping out of your personality. You didn't have to be your ego. You were now something more basic and more human. So it was like getting into your unconscious. It's the deeper self. That's a whole different way from thinking about sin and crime and stuff in the underworld. I don't mean sexual underworld in a dismissive way at all. It's where the truth is found. I've got a book called Gay Spirituality and a book called Gay Perspective. I've written very positively about the gay experience. They're all on Amazon. Yeah, there's some other Toby Johnsons in the world. But if you put Toby Johnson gay, you'll get me.
Great. Don't
I'm
forget
very
the gay
happy
part.
about that.
It's very important.
When my partner and I have been together for 37 years. When we first met, he was working in a bank in San Antonio, and I had gone in to open an account and flirted with him a little bit, and that ended up resulting in this very long-term and wonderful relationship. I was head of the Gay Alliance in those days in San Antonio, and the gay therapist in town. And one of the bank officers came to him and said, "You beware of this Toby Johnson. He's head of the homosexuals." Well, I thought that's the nicest thing anybody ever said about me. He's head of the homosexuals.
Toby Johnson, head of the homosexuals, everybody. Amazing. I love it. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your insight and your wisdom about spirituality, sexuality, all of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm proud to be here and proud to be Joseph Campbell's apostle with this wonderful way of understanding religion that frees us from all the bad stuff.
Thank you so much.
It's all a myth. It's all a myth. That's the point.
Thank you all for listening. And until next time, we'll see you on another episode of Truth, Wisdom, Freedom.